Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When James Harrison returned to Florida, he expected to see his family's home, a legacy that had stood by the ocean for over a century. Instead, he found a stranger's mansion under construction. His house was erased, his land stolen by Karen's HOA, but if she thought he would surrender, she was dead wrong. James Harrison never thought he would return to his family's old coastal property in Florida under these circumstances. At 38, he had built a successful career as an architect in New York, far removed from the sleepy seaside town where he had spent summers as a child. But after his father's passing, the news of his inheritance had awakened something in him, a longing for the simplicity of the ocean breeze, the sound of waves crashing against the shore, and the warmth of the wooden house his grandfather had built with his own hands. That house, a charming yet sturdy relic of his family's history, stood on a large plot of untouched beachfront land, passed down for over a century. It was more than just real estate. It was his legacy. After settling the legal paperwork and wrapping up his commitments in the city, James finally made the trip back. Driving down the winding roads lined with palm trees, he felt a growing sense of anticipation. He had spent weeks picturing the house in his mind, the worn but welcoming porch, the scent of salt and pine, the sunlight streaming through the windows in the morning. He imagined restoring it to its former glory, modernizing where necessary while preserving its soul. Maybe he would even move here permanently, escape the chaos of the city, and finally build something for himself. But as he pulled onto the familiar road leading to the property, something felt off. The scenery had changed. Where there had once been vast open land, there were now rows of new homes, all built in a uniform, soulless style. Identical pastel-colored structures with neatly trimmed lawns, completely out of place against the raw beauty of the coastline. James frowned, gripping the wheel tighter. This was wrong. His property was supposed to be isolated, a rare stretch of private land untouched by suburban developments. Then, as he turned the final corner, his breath caught in his throat. His heart pounded painfully against his ribs. His family home was gone. Instead of the sturdy wooden house where generations of Harrisons had lived, a half-built mansion stood in its place. The skeletal frame of the structure rose arrogantly from the ground, surrounded by construction materials, scaffolding, and workers moving about as if they had every right to be there. The land, his land, had been cleared, bulldozed, and erased of all traces of his family's history. He slammed on the brakes, barely aware of the car skidding to a halt. Disbelief turned to rage as he stepped out, his shoes crunching against the dirt where his childhood memories once stood. The house hadn't been abandoned. It hadn't been sold. There was no reason, no excuse for it to be gone. His hands clenched into fists as he marched toward the nearest worker. "Hey, what the hell is going on here?" James demanded. The man, wearing a hard hat and high-visibility vest, barely glanced at him before nodding toward a sleek black SUV parked nearby. "You'll have to take it up with the developer," the worker said, indifferent. "We're just following orders." James turned toward the SUV just as the door swung open. Out stepped a woman in her late 40s, dressed in an immaculate navy blue suit, her blonde bob neatly styled, her expression one of pure, practiced authority. He didn't need an introduction. The moment he saw the smug glint in her eyes, he knew exactly who he was dealing with. Karen Bishop, president of the Homeowners Association. She smiled, a condescending, calculated smile. "Mr. Harrison," she said smoothly, as if she had been expecting him, "I was wondering when you'd finally show up." James barely contained his rage as he stormed toward Karen, his voice like a sharp blade cutting through the salty air. "Where is my house?" His words came out measured, but the fury simmered beneath them. Karen's smirk didn't waver. Instead, she folded her arms and tilted her head slightly as if he were some misinformed child throwing a tantrum. "Your house?" she repeated, her voice dripping with faux sympathy. "Oh, Mr. Harrison, there's been a misunderstanding. That structure, well, it was deemed unsafe, outdated, and an eyesore to the community. The HOA had no choice but to act in the best interest of the neighborhood." James felt his pulse hammering in his ears. "What the hell are you talking about? My property isn't and wasn't part of any HOA. My family has owned this land for over 100 years. You had no right to do anything." Karen let out a small, rehearsed laugh, the kind that masked condescension under a veil of civility. "That's where you're mistaken," she said, reaching into a sleek leather folder and pulling out a stack of documents. "You see, according to our records, your property was officially incorporated into the Seaview Estates Homeowners Association over a decade ago. All homeowners within this jurisdiction must comply with HOA regulations." James snatched the papers from her hands and scanned them rapidly, his stomach twisting as he saw a signature at the bottom, his father's signature, but something felt wrong. His father had passed 4 years ago, and James knew for a fact that he would have never agreed to hand over the land to a homeowners association. The HOA had no authority here, yet this document claimed otherwise. "This is a fraud," James growled, clenching the papers in his fists. "My father never signed this." Karen sighed theatrically, as if dealing with an unreasonable customer. "I understand that this is difficult for you, James, but the paperwork is all legitimate. The board made repeated efforts to contact your father about necessary compliance measures, but he failed to act. When the home fell into neglect, the HOA had no choice but to step in." James's fury ignited. "Neglect? That house was fine the last time I saw it. You had no right to bulldoze my home." Karen's smile sharpened, and for the first time, a flicker of something darker crossed her eyes. Arrogance, amusement, control. "Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice now laced with irritation, "if you have an issue with HOA policies, I suggest you take it up with our legal team. But I must warn you, we have every right to develop this land. The new owner has already begun construction. Your claim is obsolete." James's breath caught in his throat. "New owner?" His voice dropped to a dangerous low. Karen didn't blink. "That's correct. The property was reassigned and sold to a developer after multiple violations went unaddressed. If you had been more proactive, perhaps this could have been avoided." James's fist tightened at his sides. This was beyond a simple HOA dispute. This was a hostile land grab, a coordinated theft, and Karen had orchestrated it down to the last legal loophole. Karen offered him one last insincere smile before turning back toward her SUV. "If you insist on pursuing this, I strongly advise you to reconsider. Legal battles are expensive, and HOA litigation rarely favors individuals." With that, she climbed into the car, slamming the door shut, leaving James standing there, the weight of injustice pressing against his chest. His home was gone. His land had been stolen. But if Karen thought this was over, she was dead wrong. James sat in the dimly lit office of Mitchell Carter, a well-regarded property attorney in town, his hands gripping the so-called legal documents Karen had handed him. The past few days had been a blur, countless phone calls, heated conversations with county clerks, and a growing realization that the entire system had been manipulated against him. But one thing had become crystal clear: the paperwork was fake. Mitchell leaned forward, adjusting his glasses as he examined the documents. He tapped his pen against his desk and exhaled sharply. "James, this is bad, but it's also sloppy." James's jaw tightened. "How bad?" Mitchell turned the papers toward him, pointing at the signature. "This document claims your father signed the HOA agreement in 2013. But look at this. This signature is an exact replica of one from an old deed he signed back in 2002. It's not just similar, James. It's identical. They copied and pasted his signature." James's pulse spiked. "You're saying—" "I'm saying," Mitchell interrupted, tossing the paper onto the desk, "that someone forged your father's signature to claim this property was part of the HOA, and since he passed 4 years ago, he obviously couldn't contest it." James felt a wave of fury surge through him. Karen and her corrupt HOA cronies had executed a deliberate land grab, using fabricated legalities to erase his family's claim. Mitchell continued, his expression growing darker. "And that's not all. I checked the county records. The HOA somehow managed to modify the plat maps last year, marking your land as part of Seaview Estates. That shouldn't have been possible without your family's approval." James's stomach churned. "Who authorized it?" Mitchell grimaced. "That's the problem. The approval came from a city planner who conveniently left his position 6 months ago. And guess who was a major donor to his retirement fund?" James didn't need to guess. "Karen." Mitchell nodded. "Karen Bishop, along with the developer she sold your land to, Westlake Properties. They've been working together for years, targeting independent property owners, fabricating HOA violations, and then seizing the land through legal means. You're just the latest victim." James's hands curled into fists. His home hadn't just been taken, it had been stolen through a systematic, fraudulent scheme. Mitchell leaned back, watching James closely. "Look, we have enough here to challenge the legitimacy of the sale, but this won't be easy. The HOA has deep pockets, and Karen has a history of crushing legal opposition before it reaches court. If we go after her, she'll fight dirty." James's rage sharpened into determination. He had already lost his house, but he refused to let them steal his family's legacy. "She can fight all she wants," James said, his voice like steel. "I'm taking my land back." James knew that fighting Karen head-on in court wouldn't be enough. She had connections, money, and a system rigged in her favor. If he wanted to win, he had to hit her where she least expected it. He needed proof, something undeniable, and he needed it fast. For the next few days, James and Mitchell dug deeper into HOA records, searching for inconsistencies. What they found confirmed their worst suspicions. Karen had been running a real estate racket, systematically absorbing properties into Seaview Estates through fraudulent HOA expansions. His case wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger scheme. But they needed more than just suspicion. They needed inside information. That's when help came from an unlikely source. Late one evening, James received a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was nervous, hesitant. "Mr. Harrison, you don't know me, but I used to work with the HOA. I have something you need to see." An hour later, James met his unexpected informant, Daniel Whitaker, a former HOA accountant, now disgraced and blacklisted. Over coffee at a quiet diner, Daniel slid a USB drive across the table. "I saw what they did to your family's land," Daniel muttered, keeping his eyes low. "It wasn't the first time. I stayed quiet for too long, but when Karen forced me out, I kept records." James plugged the USB into his laptop. What he found was explosive. Emails, internal memos, and financial records laid everything bare. HOA funds had been used to bribe officials, manipulate zoning records, and pressure independent homeowners into selling. Karen's signature was on documents authorizing the fraudulent expansion of the HOA's jurisdiction, including James's property. One file caught James's eye, a confidential memo between Karen and Westlake Properties. The subject line read, "Seaview Takeover, Final Phase." James gritted his teeth as he read Karen's words. "Harrison's property is the last holdout. We'll proceed as planned. Once the house is gone, the fight will be meaningless. He has no legal standing." Rage burned in James's chest. Karen hadn't just stolen his land. She had been planning his downfall for years. James looked at Daniel. "This is enough to bury her." Daniel nodded. "If it gets out. But be careful. Karen doesn't lose easily. If she finds out you have this." He didn't need to finish. James exhaled, his grip tightening around the USB. He had what he needed. Now it was time to bring Karen down, for good. The morning of the court hearing, the air outside the courthouse was thick with tension. James adjusted his tie, feeling the weight of generations on his shoulders. This wasn't just about reclaiming his land. It was about exposing Karen's corruption, proving his father's signature had been forged, and destroying the illegal power structure HOA had built. Inside the courtroom, Karen sat poised and confident, flanked by her high-powered attorneys. She wore her usual mask of smug indifference, but James could see the tension in her posture. She knew she had been caught. What she didn't know was just how much James had uncovered. The proceedings began with Karen's legal team striking first, attempting to invalidate James's claim outright. "Your Honor," her lead attorney, a man with the expression of a vulture, stood up. "This case is nothing more than an emotional outburst. The property in question was legally incorporated into Seaview Estates years ago, and Mr. Harrison's claims lack merit. His father's signature is on the HOA agreement, and the house was condemned for safety reasons. This lawsuit is a waste of the court's time." Mitchell rose to his feet. "Your Honor, we have evidence proving that my client's father never signed that document. The signature was copied from an older contract, making it a clear case of forgery. Furthermore, the demolition of the Harrison home was done without a permit, in direct violation of Florida state law. And finally, we have documentation proving that the HOA, under Mrs. Bishop's leadership, has been systematically stealing private properties through fraud." Karen stiffened, but her expression remained cold. The judge frowned. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Carter. Do you have the necessary documentation?" Mitchell nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. He stepped forward, handing over a thick folder of evidence. In addition, we have an inside witness, a former HOA accountant, who will testify that Karen Bishop and the Seaview Estates HOA engaged in systematic fraud. A murmur swept through the courtroom. Karen's mask cracked for the first time. Her attorney quickly whispered something to her, but the damage had been done. She hadn't expected James to have an informant from within. The judge reviewed the documents, flipping through the forged signatures, the manipulated zoning maps, and the damning email exchanges between Karen and Westlake Properties. After several minutes, he looked up sharply. "Mrs. Bishop," the judge said, his tone heavy with authority, "do you have any explanation for these documents?" Karen, for the first time, hesitated. Her carefully curated persona of absolute control was slipping. She cleared her throat and leaned forward. "Your Honor," she began, her voice even. "These accusations are completely fabricated. The Harrison property had long been a subject of community concern, and while some clerical errors may have occurred, the HOA acted in the best interest of Seaview Estates." James couldn't help but let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head. "You call stealing land and erasing a family's history a clerical error?" Karen shot him a venomous glare, but she was losing ground. The evidence was overwhelming, and when the witness testimony came, it only made things worse. Daniel Whitaker took the stand, his voice trembling at first, but growing stronger as he recounted the years of corruption, the bribes, and the false reports HOA used to justify seizing private properties. Karen's attorney tried to object, but the judge silenced him with a glare. By the end of the day, the verdict was clear. The judge ruled in James's favor. The HOA's claim to the land was deemed fraudulent. The demolition of James's house was ruled illegal. Karen was ordered to personally pay damages for destruction of property and fraud. Criminal charges were recommended for further investigation. James let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. He had won. But as he looked over at Karen, he saw something chilling. She wasn't broken. She wasn't even defeated. She was furious. And in her eyes, James saw a silent promise. This wasn't over. The courtroom victory sent shockwaves through Seaview Estates. Within days, news of the HOA's fraudulent land grabs and Karen's illegal activities spread like wildfire. Residents who had once feared her began speaking out, sharing their own experiences of manipulated property lines, excessive fines, and forced buyouts. The fallout was swift and brutal. The Seaview Estates HOA was officially dissolved, its finances frozen pending investigation. Karen was removed as president and faced multiple lawsuits from homeowners she had wronged. County officials opened an internal probe, uncovering a network of corruption tied to Karen's real estate dealings. James should have felt satisfied, but he knew Karen wasn't the type to go down quietly. And he was right. 1 week after the trial, James awoke to the sound of screeching tires outside his temporary rental. He rushed to the window, just in time to see a group of masked vandals hurling bricks through his car's windshield and smearing red paint across his front door. Scrawled in large, dripping letters was a single word: thief. Karen couldn't win in court, so she had resorted to intimidation. James filed a police report, but the authorities had no solid leads. That night, his emails were flooded with anonymous threats. Calls came from blocked numbers, whispering that he had made a big mistake. But the final straw came when he visited his property, the land he had fought so hard to reclaim. His stomach dropped. The construction site where the half-built mansion once stood was in ruins. The framework had been set on fire, leaving behind nothing but blackened wood and smoke-stained concrete. James clenched his fists, his jaw tightening in rage. This wasn't just an act of spite. This was a warning. Karen was still out there, and she wasn't finished. But neither was he. If she wanted war, he was ready to end it, once and for all. James stood at the edge of his scarred property, the salty ocean air mixing with the faint, acrid scent of burnt wood. The remnants of Karen's final act of vengeance were still visible. Charred beams, twisted metal, and piles of rubble where a house had once stood. But unlike before, he wasn't furious. He wasn't consumed by rage or despair. Instead, he felt a deep, unshakable resolve. Karen had tried to erase his family's legacy, to rewrite history in her favor, but history had fought back and won. With the HOA dismantled, Karen facing criminal charges, and the fraudulent land grab exposed, James could finally focus on what truly mattered, restoring what was rightfully his. James wasted no time. He hired a crew, but not just any crew. He found local craftsmen, builders whose families had been in the area for generations, men who remembered the original house and respected what it had meant. The foundation was carefully relaid, matching the original footprint of his grandfather's home. A new structure took shape, a perfect blend of old and new, honoring the past while embracing the future. Historic elements were restored. Wood salvaged from the wreckage was repurposed into furniture, beams, and railings. Every nail driven, every plank placed was a defiant statement. The Harrisons were still here. As James rebuilt, Karen crumbled. Her former allies abandoned her, scrambling to distance themselves from the scandal. She lost her home, forced to sell after drowning in legal fees. And finally, she was arrested, charged with fraud, property destruction, and conspiracy. The woman who once wielded power through fear had been reduced to nothing. And James, he had his land, he had his legacy, and soon he would have his home again. As he stood on the new porch, gazing at the endless ocean, he finally felt at peace. Karen had tried to destroy him, but in the end, she had only made him stronger. The sun dipped low over the ocean, casting a golden glow across the waves as James stood on the porch of his newly built home. The freshly stained wood smelled rich and earthy, blending with the salty sea air. It was different from the house his grandfather had built, stronger, more modern, but it carried the same spirit. It was still Harrison land, untouched by corporate greed, still standing despite everything that had tried to erase it. Seaview Estates wasn't the same either. With the HOA dissolved, homeowners who had once lived under Karen's iron grip began reclaiming their independence. The endless fines, the oppressive regulations, the fear of retaliation, all gone. Neighbors who had once whispered behind closed doors now spoke openly, relieved to be free of Karen's rule. Some homeowners sued, demanding compensation for the years of extortion. The county launched a full investigation, leading to new protections against HOA overreach. For the first time in years, the community actually felt like a neighborhood again, not a gated dictatorship. Karen's fall from power had been swift and brutal. Her assets were seized, her bank accounts drained from legal fees and settlements. She was convicted of fraud, document forgery, and conspiracy, sentenced to several years in prison. Her name became a cautionary tale, spoken in hushed tones by those who once feared her. James had considered attending her sentencing, just to watch the final nail go into the coffin of her empire. But in the end, he decided she wasn't worth his time. She had already lost. As James took a slow walk along the shoreline, waves lapping at his feet, he reflected on everything that had happened. He had lost his family home, but he had gained something even greater, a deeper connection to his roots. He had fought for his land, for his family's name, and for every homeowner who had been bullied into submission. And he had won. The new house was complete, and soon his sister and her children would visit, filling it with laughter again. He was considering staying here permanently, swapping city life for the peace of the ocean. His family's legacy was secure, not just for himself, but for generations to come. As he looked out at the vast open horizon, James smiled. Karen had tried to bury the past, erase his history, and steal what was his, but she had failed. And now, James could finally start living the life he was always meant to have,